Hello, we're glad you've joined us for this live webinar, Instrument Compliance for a Quality System, a candid conversation about IQ, OQ, PQ. I'm Judy O'Rourke of LabRoots, and I'll be moderating this session. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots, the leading scientific social networking website and provider of virtual events and webinars advancing scientific collaboration and learning. It's brought to you by Thermo Fisher Scientific. Thermo Fisher is a world leader in serving science, whose mission is to enable customers to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. For more information on our sponsor, please visit www.thermofisher.com. Let's get started. You can pose questions to the speakers during the presentation while they're fresh in your mind. To do so, simply type them into the drop-down box located on the far left of your screen labeled Ask a Question and click on the Send button. Questions will be answered after the presentation. To enlarge the slide window, click on the arrows at the top right-hand corner of the presentation window. If you experience technical problems seeing or hearing the presentation, just click on the Support tab found at the top right of the presentation window, or report your problem by typing it into the Answer a Question box located on the far left of your screen. This is an educational webinar and thus offers free continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right of the presentation window and follow the process of obtaining your credits. I now present today's speakers, Randall Albright, the Global Product Manager for Compliance and Professional Services at Thermo Fisher Scientific, and Dean Rainbolt, the Technical Applications Manager for the Cold Storage Division at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Randall Albright is responsible for the business segments of the qualifications, computer system validation, and analytical validation services for the Applied Biosystems, Invitrogen, and Ion Torrent instruments. His prior background includes several years as a U.S. FDA investigator, specializing in medical devices and imports. Randall brings over 25 years of industry experience in biotechnology and engineering. Dean Rainbolt has over 28 years of pharmaceutical experience and spent more than 21 of those supporting multiple business units. These include development stability, corporate reference standards, and analytical testing labs, as well as the bioassay group in regard to asset management, validation, and qualification services. He was the primary audit contact in these areas, an auditor for other internal business units, and is considered a process validation expert among his peers. Randall Albright and Dean Rainbolt will now begin their presentations.
Welcome, everyone, to Thermo Fisher Scientific's webinar about instrument and equipment compliance through a qualification. My name is Randall Albright, and I'm here representing Thermo Fisher Scientific's Life Sciences Division.
And I'm Dean Rainbolt, representing the Controlled Temperature Technologies Group within the Laboratory Products Division.
Let's quickly review the learning objectives for this webinar. We will learn where a qualification comes from. We will learn what a qualification is and what Thermo Fisher Scientific provides in its IQ, OQ, and PQ from both the life sciences instrumentation and cold storage equipment. We will learn when qualifications are performed, why qualifications are important, and where they can be applied. Hey, Dean, in order for our audience to fully understand the value of a qualification, I think it's essential to have a basic idea of what process validation is. Now, I attended your wonderful webinar a while back, and I know you're an expert in this area. Can you give us some perspective?
Well, thanks, Randall. I'm glad you enjoyed the audit readiness webinar. Hillary Thompson of the Instrument and Equipment Service Team and I enjoyed working together to address questions regarding what things to consider to prepare for an audit. So let's get to it. What is process validation? We can break it into 4 segments. First, there is the process plan, which needs to include information such as what regulations are to be followed and what industry standards should be considered. Next, we have qualification. This would include everything from facility and utility preparations to completion of equipment testing. Third is the validation report, which provides an overview of the entire validation project. The report is reviewed and signed by the system owner and quality. And last on the list is the workflow release, which is the collection of documents produced during a validation project that would include the appropriate signatures for release.
Thanks, Dean, for that overview. As Dean described, the qualification of equipment, instrumentation, and associated software is an integral part of process validation. Here is the specific Code of Federal Regulation, or CFR section, for process validation that Dean defined earlier for us. This CFR and the complementary ISO standards applicable for medical devices, 13485, require that validation, particularly of manufacturing, shall be performed. I have highlighted some of the important language that the guidance documents help interpret. Subsection A calls out when process validation needs to be done where results cannot be fully verified. Subsection B calls out more details of who, what, and how, and when process validation should be done. Specifically, qualified individuals shall document all stated requirements with a process to review, evaluate, and revalidate where appropriate. Note that despite having explicit elements and tasks for manufacturers to follow, it does not call out the qualification mechanism. So where do qualifications come from? It is in the FDA Medical Device Quality Systems Guidance document from 1996 that first officially established the use of IQ, OQ, and PQ terminology for medical devices, separate from the previous medical device GMP regulation. But it is in the 2004 release of Global Harmonization Task Force Process Validation Guidance document, which is an internationally harmonized document recognized by both the US FDA and ISO, that further clarifies the definition of IQ, OQ, and PQ, how it is applied, and establishes the qualification as the industry standard mechanism to document performance for medical devices. Just as a fun fact, qualification is not just an industry standard for medical devices. For example, everyone has heard of Amazon. Well, Amazon qualifies the conveyance systems in their shipping warehouses and performs a computer system validation of the software that operates those conveyance systems. For perspective and to better understand subsection B, I have also provided the FDA quality systems definition of established for this audience. Established being defined as define, document, and implement. Moving back into the CFR definitions, if we dig deep into 820.70G, it defines the essentials of what equipment performance needs to be documented. As before, I have highlighted the pertinent language that guidance interprets for industry. Again, it's not calling out IQ, OQ, or PQ mechanism, but rather what needs to be documented. I have called out the subsection specific to manufacturer requirements for maintenance, inspection, and adjustment of equipment. Implicit in each of these is documentation. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain schedules for the maintenance of equipment. Each manufacturer shall conduct periodic inspections in accordance with established procedures. And each manufacturer shall ensure that inherent limitations or allowable tolerances are posted on or near equipment. Now that we have established the industry standard origin of qualification from within regulation and standards for process validation, we can move on to what a qualification is. As most of you will be familiar, there are three components to a qualification: installation, operational, and performance. Notice an additional chevron below PQ on this slide. Here is where Thermo Fisher Scientific Life Sciences Group differentiates its RUO, or research use only, and IVD, or in vitro diagnostic, DX branded instrument products. The PQ is performed with the DX IVD instrumentation, and the IPV, or instrument performance verification, is performed with the RUO, or research use only instruments. To be clear, for our audience, this is strictly Thermo Fisher Scientific nomenclature to differentiate our instrumentation and the qualification services. For all intents and purposes, they are equivalent. Where we have instrument systems as both DX or IVD and RUO, and the standard for performance is the same, the process and specification for passing will be the same. All three components make up a qualification protocol. We will be speaking in more detail for each of these qualification components, as well as the difference between a hardware product PQ and a workflow process PQ.
Thanks, Randall. One thing that I'd like to add here is that the qualification is the customer's responsibility. And by that, I mean that the customer should have pre-approved documents to capture the tasks being completed during the qualification. With cold storage testing, we can provide the temperature mapping to fulfill the requirement of a qualification document. The customer will be responsible for the details of the tests, such as test duration, open door sample pulse simulation, and power-off testing. The customer is also responsible for defining the pass-fail of any testing that is performed.
Moving on to the details. The first component of a qualification is installation. By definition, the installation qualification will establish with confidence that process equipment and ancillary systems are installed to manufacturer's recommendations. Additional supporting details about installation instructions and test procedures can be found in section 820.170 installation. What does Thermo Fisher Scientific interpret this to mean for the installation of instrumentation? It means we will verify and document instruments or equipment against an order invoices, any site requirements specific to the instrument or equipment, any configuration details of the instrument or equipment, and any specific installation criteria. It should be noted that the IQ or installation qualification is not repeated once the instrument or equipment is successfully installed. Follow-on qualifications would be an OQ-PQ.
Now, it's also common for companies to include updating their computerized maintenance management system, or CMMS, at this step. This ensures that the new asset is in the system and all maintenance activities are being tracked and documented. This is also the place that future scheduled PMs can be pre-scheduled so that the instrument will be maintained in a qualified state.
Component 2 of the qualification is operational. By definition, the operational qualification will establish with confidence that process equipment and ancillary systems are capable of consistently operating within the manufacturer's established limits and specification tolerances. Additional supporting detail can be found in 820.72, Inspection, Measuring, and Test Equipment, 820.80, Acceptance Activities, and Subpart N of 820.200, Servicing, all in the Code of Federal Regulations. Thermo Fisher Scientific has broken down the operational section into effective subsystems of our instruments and equipment. For example, some of the subsystems and testing are done are internal self-test diagnostics, thermal testing, lamp laser alignment checks, and other optical calibrations.
Now, in most cases or instances in the cold storage business, a temperature mapping would be performed. This test would be done with the unit empty, and that's to show that the unit performs as specified by the manufacturer.
The final component of a qualification is performance qualification, or instrument performance verification. Remember, Thermo Fisher Scientific uses PQ for its DX or IVD instruments and IPV for its RUO instruments. By definition, the performance qualification, or instrument performance verification, will establish with confidence that the process equipment or ancillary systems are performing to manufacturer recommendations by demonstration with objective evidence. Now, this might be a bit confusing. For most common understanding of a PQ or performance qualification establishes the limits and specifications for the entire workflow or process, including the equipment, instruments, and software. In the case of Thermo Fisher Scientific, the instrument hardware qualification PQ component is focused on the workflow of the instrument hardware as a product PQ, not as the larger workflow or process PQ that the instrument is being used in. Our hardware PQ establishes the utility of the instrument to a standard independently from its suitability for use in the total process workflow. Thus, the Thermo Fisher Scientific instrument hardware qualification becomes a supporting element in the larger process validation. Unfortunately, Thermo Fisher cannot perform the process validation for you. Some examples of a hardware PQ or IPV standard Thermo Fisher Scientific uses in its instrumentation is the RNA-SP plate for the qPCR or quantitative PCR instruments, sequencing or gene scan standards for its capillary or CE electrophoresis instruments, control beads or synthetic controls in our NGS or next generation sequencing.
And now for cold storage, temperature mapping is always the best test method to answer the many PQ questions required by the customer. Testing with the unit with a simulated load, open door to simulate sample pulls, power off testing for possible future power failures, and different shelf configuration testing are some of the common tests that are included in the PQ. If the unit can be used at different temperatures, testing at each possible set point will also be needed.
Now that we know what a qualification is, we can ask, when are qualifications required? Installation or relocation should be points of common understanding. However, I find our other bullet points here can be less understood. Most of the life sciences instrumentation will have an annual planned maintenance recommendation. The focus of this is purely maintenance and to maintain performance within specifications. Examples of this are cleaning of optics, fans, thermal blocks, and associated computer maintenance such as defragmenting. After such an activity, it would be recommended to document the continued performance of the system as a requalification. Similarly, we use a risk-based approach in alignment with FDA philosophy to make a recommendation to customers about requalification after each and every service event. The determination is based on the guidance language significant to the performance of the system. Let me provide the audience with an example of how this risk-based recommendation is applied. If a field service engineer replaces a door hinge assembly, that has nothing to do with how the instrument operates or generates data, it would not be triggering a requalification. However, if the field service engineer replaces a halogen lamp, which would be changing the fluorescent intensity as well as the filter and dye calibration on the instrument, this would have an impact on the data, thus would generate a requalification. Dean, are there any equipment qualification variations from my instrument-based example?
Sure. Let me briefly touch on as-found testing versus post-maintenance testing. The strategy for cold storage qualification timing is very similar to the life sciences approach. There is one additional time point that I've seen added to the qualification strategy with some pharmaceutical companies. This qualification, which is usually referred to as an as-found test, is simply a temperature mapping exercise with the existing sample load that is performed before certain PM work is started. Testing unit prior to the PM serves to close the bracket, so to speak, of data from the last qualification until before the PM that will be performed. By bracketing this data, it will considerably shorten or eliminate the risk of a long investigation of samples for an equipment failure that may have been caused during the PM. After the PM work has been completed, adjustments can be made to dial in the unit so it will operate at its peak performance without any risk. Once the unit is dialed in, post-testing is done so that the unit can be released for use. Now, please keep in mind that there are only a few situations that have warranted this as-found testing, but it is a viable option.
Why are qualifications important? Qualifications are important as documented evidence of performance over time. As we have established in the previous slide, qualifications are periodic and ongoing necessity. Qualifications support quality management systems, process validation, mitigate risk to results, they provide sample integrity, and provide evidence of suitability for use or intended use. Now, I want to pause here. I believe this is the most overlooked concept when it comes to understanding the qualification. I believe Dean will agree. What I typically see is customers looking at the price of the service, trying to mitigate their operating costs. However, let me share an FDA experience with you all that I think is a perfect case study, especially for those in the LDT and IVD environments. I was assigned the investigation of a for-cause action of a medical device manufacturer based on an MDR, or medical device reportable event. The MDR reported was on a clinical lab who supplied results to a hospital where a patient was injured through a prescription of an incorrect therapeutic. Because the clinical lab maintained excellent device history records with qualifications, sample processing, and operator use, the investigation was quickly able to narrow down the potential impact. Between the medical device manufacturer and the clinical lab, established what instrument, what operator, and what sample was in question. Using the device history file, we segregated the sample populations in question, processed to one instrument, and the possible time frame of the potential deviation that caused the injury. Reviewing the qualification in the device history file, the lab showed that the last qualification of the instrument was still in specification. A subsequent qualification of the instrument performed during the investigation showed it was still in specification, thus ruling out the instrument and the samples processed adjacent and subsequently to the sample in question. The investigation ultimately concluded with sample contamination as a cause for the missed result. But for the good laboratory and documentation practices and consistent instrument qualifications in the device history file, the investigation was able to, with assistance from the manufacturer and operators, to quickly eliminate and mitigate the impact to clinical operations, other patients, and resolve root cause. Now, Dean, I know you've had similar experiences from another perspective. Do you have another story to share?
Well, sure. Now let's just see if I can stick to one example here, because it's very common for businesses to consider cutting qualification and service budgets first to save money. That decision is usually made by folks unfamiliar with the importance of maintaining equipment in a qualified state. So in this case, we were performing an internal audit of a customer complaint for a product that had been on the market for several years. The audit was focused on the organization that stores marketed products to be used as a reference standard if needed. Now, storage of these reference standards in the proper condition is critical and tightly monitored, as a loss of product reference could lead to a product recall, and nobody wants a recall if it's not a drug quality related recall. Now, during the audit, we pulled all of the documentation needed to show that the unit was running within a qualified state. That included the initial IQ, OQ, and PQ documents. It also included the relevant maintenance records and the last qualification documentation prior to the time that the samples were pulled and tested. This ensured that sample safety had been maintained and there was no reason to dispute the sample test results at this level. This group had fulfilled its commitment to sample safety and equipment integrity. Without a well-thought-out qualification strategy, including proper implementation, this could have gone a whole nother direction. The purchase of the right equipment is the first step to success. Maintaining that equipment in a qualified state ensures ongoing success. So let's talk about process validation and qualification myths. Myth 1, validation of a process, equipment, or instruments is only done once. No. Revalidation is required for process changes. Reference 21 CFR 82070 B3. Changes to equipment or instrument, or specification changes would trigger reevaluation. Revalidation should be performed if performance of equipment or instruments documented in the qualifications show any deviations or negative trends. Revalidation should be performed if there are process failures or CAPA-related activities. On to myth 2. Validation is only necessary for process where subsequent verification is possible. Validation should be considered even if your process includes 100% verification. 100% verification is not necessarily 100% effective in a process. Myth number 3 is validation is burdensome. Yes, validation can be burdensome and costly, but planning is key to mitigation of this point. Validation is also an investment in the process, equipment, instrumentation, and personnel. It helps you understand the controls necessary to reduce variability. Reducing variability reduces risk to results and products from the process and reduces operational costs. A well-planned process validation improves customer satisfaction and confidence.
Myth 4. My field service report or planned maintenance report is sufficient to document performance. No. To understand why a service report or maintenance protocol cannot stand in for a qualification is because of the intention of the document. This is how a potential investigator will establish the utility of the documentation being provided by a firm. The intent of a service report is to document the scope of service event required. A maintenance protocol intention is to document the manufacturer's recommended maintenance activity has been performed. Only a qualification is the industry-accepted mechanism to document performance, as called out in the Global Harmonization Task Force, also the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and FDA Medical Device Quality Systems Regulations Guidance documents we spoke about in the beginning of the webinar. Where are qualifications applicable? Here is my attempt to align some of the applicable standards and regulations to customer segments that should consider process validation and qualification services. For Thermo Fisher Scientific as a manufacturer, we will be looking at Part 820, the ISO 9001 and 1345. For some of you in the audience, your interests may align with CLIA, CAP, and the ISO 15189. But understand these are only some of the more globally accepted markets and qualifications. There will be many local, regional, or international governmental entities which will also support the use of a qualification to document performance of equipment or instrumentation as part of a workflow. We recommend using the guidance documents from the Global Harmonization Task Force, International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and the Food and Drug Administration as reference starting points. Because science can't wait on non-compliance, Dee and I would like to circle back to the webinar learning objectives. We have learned about process validation and the origin of a qualification as the industry standard, what a qualification is, and what Thermo Fisher Scientific provides in its IQ, OQ, and PQ, when qualifications are performed, why qualifications are important, and where qualifications can be applied. Thermo Fisher Scientific is very proud of our mission. Providing compliance and qualification services is one of many ways Thermo Fisher Scientific supports you, our customer, your laboratory processes and quality systems to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. For more information about Thermo Fisher Scientific qualifications of instrumentation, equipment, or other compliance-related products, we urge you to reach out and contact us. You can visit our webpage or email us for additional details, or call us to have a conversation with one of our specialists. We will be happy to address any follow-up questions through our teams. On behalf of myself, Randall Albright, representing Thermo Fisher Scientific Life Sciences,
and me, Dean Rainbolt, representing the Controlled Temperatures Technologies Group within the Laboratory Products Division,
we appreciate your attendance in our qualification webinar.
Thank you, Randall and Dean, for your presentations. A quick reminder for our audience on how to submit questions. Simply type them into the drop-down box located on the far left of your presentation window, labeled Ask a Question, and click on the Send button. Randall Albright and Dean Rainbolt will answer as many questions as time permits. The first question is, what are the risks if I create or do the qualification myself?
I can answer that one. The risk of a customer-developed protocol is, will it be adequate to document performance of the medical device or system? Being disconnected from the design process typically leads to a customer protocol skipping operational areas that would have been captured by the manufacturer.
Thank you. Next question is, how much time can I save by having the manufacturer of record perform the qualification versus using in-house resources?
I don't have any specific statistics on this, but the length of time to develop a qualification protocol would be dependent on the complexity of the system, workflow, and the risk tolerance of the workflow. Having a manufacturer qualify their instrumentation equipment allows quality systems to focus on the risk tolerance of the workflow, making the equipment qualification or instrument qualification more plug and play to the validation process.
Thank you. Next one is, how often should I requalify an instrument?
This is a risk determination by the manufacturer's recommendation and the risk tolerance of the workflow. Thermo Fisher Scientific uses that risk-based determination to make a recommendation to requalify. At minimum, for the Life Sciences Group instrumentation, we would recommend after a planned maintenance or after a critical maintenance that is significant to the performance of the system.
Thanks for that. Looks like we have time for one more question. How long does it take Thermo Fisher to perform their qualification services?
For the life sciences instrumentation, it depends on the type of instrument, but typically between half a day and 2.5 days of on-site time with a field service engineer or application scientist, depending on the application.
Yeah, and also it depends on what the customer needs, which is usually a minimum of one 24-hour test up to several days of temperature mapping to fulfill the requirements of an OQ-PQ. And that would be in the cold storage area.
Well, I would like to once again thank Randall Albright and Dean Rainbolt for their presentations. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today will be addressed by the speakers via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. We would like to thank our sponsor, Thermo Fisher Scientific, for underwriting today's educational webcast. And until next time, goodbye.